The amber lights of my father's whiskey collection gleamed behind the antique bar as I hunched over quarterly projections in the empty restaurant. 3 years of business school, 5 years managing our Chicago location, and countless 18-hour days weren't enough to convince my parents I was ready to lead Rossi's. So here I was, midnight approaching, recalculating profit margins while across town, my parents discussed selling our 40-year family legacy to strangers. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus on the numbers that increasingly blurred together on my laptop screen. The restaurant was silent now, the last of the kitchen staff having left hours ago. Only the occasional rumble of the L train passing nearby broke the stillness. I'd grown up in this place, learned to make pasta at 5, bussed, tables at 10, worked every station in the kitchen through high school. Now, at 28, I knew every creaking floorboard, every temperamental burner on the stove, every regular customer's preference. This wasn't just a business to me. It was home. My phone vibrated against the polished mahogany bar top. Dad's name lit up the screen. Despite the exhaustion weighing on my shoulders, hope flickered briefly. Maybe he'd reconsidered. Maybe the meeting with the corporate buyers hadn't gone well. I answered immediately. "Hey, Dad, how did it—" I stopped mid-sentence. He hadn't meant to call me. I could hear his voice, distant but clear, talking to someone else. The restaurant's ambient noise told me they were at Vitelli's, the upscale, Italian place across town where they always took important clients. "Marco's too emotional about the business," my father's voice carried through, unaware I was listening. "He still thinks he can take over someday." My mother's response came next, her tone dismissive. "He's too young, too inexperienced. The Carlyle Group is offering $7 million. We'd be fools to turn that down for sentiment." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I knew they were meeting with potential buyers, but they'd promised it was just exploratory, just to understand our options, just as a backup plan for their retirement. "Besides," came my Uncle Tony's unmistakable baritone, "the kid doesn't have the killer instinct, too soft with the staff, too willing to try these modern ideas instead of sticking with tradition." What about his proposal? A voice I didn't recognize. Probably the broker they'd hired. My father's laugh was sharp, cutting through the background noise. Expanding to 3 more locations? Investing in that online ordering platform? Adding a cooking class program? The contempt in his voice made my stomach twist. Dreams, fantasies. He has no idea what it takes to actually run this business. "Robert," my mother again, using my father's full name as she always did when making a point. "Marco will be fine. He has his degree. He can go work for one of those fancy restaurant groups he's always talking about. The Carlyle offer includes keeping the Rossi name and recipes. That's more than fair. And the non-compete won't affect him," Uncle Tony added. "They're only restricting us from opening another restaurant in Illinois for 5 years. By then, he'll have found something else." A non-compete? They hadn't mentioned that in any of our family discussions. My hand trembled as I gripped the phone tighter, unable to end the call, unable to stop listening to them dismantle my future so casually. "The best part," my father continued, his voice lowering conspiratorially, "is that Marco has no idea what the business is really worth. He thinks we're struggling because that's what I've told him for years. Kept him hungry, motivated." The others laughed, the sound of clinking glasses following. They were toasting to deceiving me. "Remember when he offered to take a pay cut last year to help with cash flow?" my mother added, amusement in her voice. "Meanwhile, we cleared almost $1 million in profit." "Hiding the good wine from the staff, hiding the profits from the sun," Uncle Tony quipped. "Same principle." Laughter continued as I sat frozen in place, the restaurant suddenly feeling colder, emptier. Every sacrifice I'd made, the weekends worked while friends enjoyed their 20s, the vacations canceled to cover staff shortages, the relationship that fell apart because I was never available, all based on a lie. The struggling family business, That needed my dedication wasn't struggling at all. I finally pressed the end call button, setting the phone down with unnatural care as the reality sank in. They'd never intended to pass the business to me. The talk of someday and when you're ready had been empty promises to keep me working for below-market salary, pouring my heart and soul into building something I would never own. The spreadsheet on my screen now seemed like a cruel joke. My detailed expansion proposal showing how we could grow Rossi's from 2 locations to 5 within 3 years. Hours of market research, financial projections, and passionate vision, all destined for the trash, while my parents pocketed millions and left me with nothing but a handshake and a non-compete clause that would prevent me from even using my own family recipes. Something shifted inside me, past the hurt, past the betrayal. A cold clarity emerged as I stared at the amber bottles behind the bar, my reflection distorted but somehow sharper than before. I'd spent years analyzing restaurant operations, understanding market trends, building relationships with vendors and staff. How had I missed what was happening right in front of me? I closed my laptop and stood up, my posture straightening almost of its own accord. I walked slowly behind the bar, selected a bottle of the 30-year Macallan my father kept hidden, for special occasions, and poured myself 2 fingers. The whiskey burned going down, but the pain felt clarifying, necessary. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Sorry, pocket dial. Everything okay?" I stared at his message, at how easily the lie came to him. I typed back, "All good. How's the meeting? Going?" His response came quickly. "Just a casual dinner with Tony. Nothing important." Another lie. So effortless. So practiced. I set my empty glass down on the bar and opened my laptop again. But instead of returning to my expansion proposal, for Rossi's, I opened a new document and titled it something I should have created years ago. Exit Strategy. The title stared back at me, both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to please my parents or save their business. I was thinking about how to save myself, and they would never see it coming. Financial. Statements and tax returns covered the dining room table in my apartment like fallen leaves. Each page a record of my family's deception, each number a betrayal. I'd spent the past week methodically gathering evidence, starting with the accounting files I technically wasn't supposed to have access to. The restaurant management software gave me everything: P&L statements, cash flow analyses, tax filings, the complete financial picture my parents had kept hidden from me. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I barely noticed as I traced a finger over the highlighted figures. The struggling family business had cleared $975,000 in profit last year alone. Nearly $1 million while I was earning $62,000 as Xiao, the general manager, believing I was making a sacrifice for our family's future. The same year I'd declined a $95,000 offer from Maggiano's restaurant group because my father had guilted me, saying they needed me to weather the storm. What storm? The documents showed 5 consecutive years of growth. The second location I'd pushed to open, against my parents' feigned reluctance, had doubled our revenue stream within 18 months. My risky farm-to-table initiative had cut our food costs by 12% while increasing our menu prices by 20%. The unnecessary online ordering system I'd implemented during the pandemic had generated a 31% increase in sales that never disappeared when in-person dining returned. I had created value they never acknowledged, driving growth they pretended didn't exist. All while believing I wasn't yet ready to take the reins. "Jesus, Marco," Alyssa whispered from across the table. My older sister had flown in from Seattle when I called her, the only person I trusted with what I'd discovered. Unlike me, she'd never wanted to join the family business, pursuing architecture instead. I knew Dad was controlling, but this is calculated. I pushed the most damning document toward her, A preliminary agreement with the Carlyle Group dated 3 months ago. Not just exploratory talks. They'd been actively negotiating for months. It says here they're keeping the executive chef and sous chef, but restructuring general management, Alyssa noted, her finger tracing the clause. They were going to fire you after the sale, Marco, while preventing me from opening my own place anywhere in Illinois, I added, pointing to the non-compete clause. 5 years, Ailey. They were going to take away everything I've built and make it impossible for me to start over. Alyssa's face hardened, the same expression she wore when defending me from neighborhood bullies as kids. So what's the plan? I opened my laptop, showing her a spreadsheet I'd created. The Carlyle Group is offering $7 million. That values each location at roughly $3.5 million. And I think they're undervaluing us, I said, switching to another tab. Based on comparable restaurant sales in Chicago, our revenue stream, brand recognition, and growth potential, we're worth closer to $9 million, maybe more. Alyssa studied me for a moment. Marco, even if you're right, what does it matter? Mom and Dad own the business. Not entirely, I said, pulling up the original incorporation documents. When Grandpa Rossi set up the business, he created a slightly unusual structure. Dad and Uncle Tony each own 47.5%. The remaining 5% was left to future generations of Rossis once they reached 25 and worked in the business for at least 5 years. Alyssa's eyes widened. You've met those conditions. 3 years ago, I confirmed. But here's what's interesting. They never formally transferred the shares to me, probably because they didn't want me to see the financials. But legally, those shares are mine. And there's a clause here that any sale requires approval from all shareholders. You could block the sale, Alyssa said, realization dawning. I could, but I won't, I replied, pulling up another document. Because I have a better idea. The next morning, I called James Wong, my former business school classmate who now worked in restaurant acquisitions for Horizon Partners. We'd kept in touch, occasionally meeting for drinks when he was in Chicago scouting new properties. He'd made casual offers to introduce me to his bosses several times, impressed by what I'd done with Rossi's, but I'd always declined out of family loyalty. Marco Rossi, James answered on the second ring. Please tell me you finally come to your senses and want to work for people who'll actually appreciate you. Not exactly, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. But I do have a business proposition for Horizon. How quickly can you be in Chicago? 48 hours later, I sat across from James and his boss, Catherine Chen, in a private room at Gibson's Steakhouse. I'd brought my detailed business plan, complete with expansion strategies, modernization initiatives, and revenue projections. The same plan my father had dismissed as fantasies. These numbers are impressive, Catherine said, examining our growth trajectory. And you've achieved this while your parents were actively constraining capital investment? They believed in the traditional approach, I explained diplomatically. Minimal debt, slow growth, proven concepts. Their loss, James interjected. The multi-experience dining concept you're proposing here. Restaurant, cooking classes, retail. Component. That's exactly where the high-end market is heading. Catherine closed the folder and fixed me with an appraising look. So, Marco, what exactly are you proposing? You want us to make a competing offer to your parents? No, I said, leaning forward. I want you to back me in buying them out. I outlined my plan. Horizon would provide the capital for me to make an offer marginally higher than Carlyle's. I would contribute my industry expertise and local connections. We would form a new company with me as the majority owner and operational leader, while Horizon would hold a significant minority stake with specific return benchmarks. It's unconventional, Catherine admitted after I finished. We typically acquire businesses outright. True, I acknowledged, but this way you get a passionate operator who knows every aspect of the business, plus you avoid the transition risks. that come with leadership changes. And you still get your return? James was already nodding. The staff loyalty alone is worth considering. From what I've seen, they'd walk through fire for Marco. That's hard to put a price on in this industry. Catherine studied me with new interest. You'd really go against your family this way? I met her gaze steadily. My family was planning to sell the business I've dedicated my life to without giving me a chance to take over. They were going to let the new owners fire me and prevent me from opening a competing restaurant. I'd say they went against me first. She nodded slowly, then extended her hand. We'll need to run the numbers and get board approval, but conceptually, I'm interested. Very interested. As we shook hands, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for what I was losing, excitement for what lay ahead, and a cold satisfaction, knowing that soon my parents would learn I wasn't too young or inexperienced after all. One more thing, I added as Catherine was gathering her papers. Time is critical. The Carlisle deal is moving forward. We need to move faster. How fast? She asked. I smiled for the first time in days. I believe the phrase is shark speed. My laptop screen glowed in the dimly lit corner booth of Rossi's as I reviewed the final offer document from Horizon Partners. The restaurant had closed an hour ago, but I lingered, unable to leave. This place had been my sanctuary since childhood, where I'd hidden beneath tables during family arguments, where I'd celebrated every milestone, where I'd grown from a pasta-loving kid to a business-minded adult. Now it might truly become mine, though not in the way I'd always imagined. You sure about this? Eliza asked, sliding into the booth across from me. As Rossi's head chef for the past decade, she was the only staff member I'd trusted with my plan. Her loyalty had been to me, not my parents, ever since I'd defended her menu innovations when my father wanted to fire her for disrespecting tradition. I've never been more sure of anything, I replied, turning the laptop so she could see the offer. $7.8 million, structured as a clean buyout with no earn-out conditions or complex contingencies. Just enough to beat Carlisle's offer, but not so, much as to seem desperate. And the timing? Eliza asked, scanning the document. The Carlisle agreement has a 10-day exclusivity clause ending this Friday. My parents can't legally entertain other offers until then, I explained. We'll submit ours next Monday morning, giving them the weekend to celebrate thinking they've locked in the deal. Eliza raised an eyebrow. Cold. They've had this planned for months, Liz, all while letting me work 80-hour weeks thinking I was saving the family legacy. My voice remained steady, though the hurt still felt fresh. They were never going to give me a real chance. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. What about your ownership stake? The 5% you legally own? My attorney is preparing a formal notice asserting my ownership rights. We'll deliver it simultaneously with the offer. I closed the laptop, suddenly exhausted. If they try to close, with Carlisle without my consent, we'll file an injunction. And if they accept your offer instead? I hadn't allowed myself to fully imagine that outcome. Then I become their boss. The thought brought a bittersweet satisfaction. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. I wanted the chance I'd earned. If it took becoming the owner instead of the heir to get it, so be it. Eliza stood to leave, pausing to squeeze my shoulder. For what it's worth, the staff would follow you anywhere, Marco. Your parents built these walls, but you built what matters. The team, the culture, the future. After she left, I walked through the empty restaurant, running my fingers along the bar where I'd first learned to make simple syrup, past the kitchen where I'd mastered every station, through the dining room where I'd grown from busboy to host, to manager. Every inch held memories, held pieces of me. It was never about the money, I whispered to the empty room. It was about belonging. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Meeting with Carlisle tomorrow to finalize terms. We should grab lunch next week to discuss your next steps. Next steps. As if my entire career had been a temporary phase, a stepping stone to something else. as if the business I'd helped transform wasn't mine to claim. I typed back, "Sounds good. Proud of you and Mom for this achievement." The lie felt strange on my fingers, but necessary. Just 10 more days. The next morning, I met with my attorney, Sandra Lopez, in her downtown office. The view of Lake Michigan stretched behind her as she reviewed our strategy. "We've verified your ownership stake," she confirmed, sliding a document across her desk. "The corporate structure your grandfather created explicitly grants you 5% upon meeting those conditions. It's ironclad. And they can't sell without my consent?" "Not legally," Sandra replied. "Any attempt to do so would constitute shareholder oppression under Illinois law." I nodded, the legal confirmation bolstering my resolve. "What about my role in the new entity? Will Horizon try to push me out once we acquire it?" "The operating agreement is structured to protect you," she assured me, turning to another tab in her binder. "You'll retain 51% ownership, giving you controlling interest. Horizon gets 49% with specific approval rights over major capital expenditures and indebtedness, but day-to-day operations remain entirely your domain. And the financing? Horizon is providing 90% of the purchase price. Your contribution is $780,000 for your 51% stake." She studied me carefully. "That's still substantial capital, Marco. Are you comfortable with that level of personal investment?" The number would drain most of my savings. The money I'd carefully accumulated over years of living below my means, believing I was helping the family business weather non-existent storms. It was almost poetic to use it this way instead. "I am," I confirmed. "I've built detailed financial projections based on our actual performance, not the watered-down versions my parents showed me. If we execute my expansion plan, we'll double revenue within 3 years." Sandra's expression remained professional, but I caught a glimpse of admiration. "In all my years handling business transitions, I've rarely seen someone as prepared as you are. Your parents severely underestimated you." The observation landed with unexpected weight. "They always have," I said quietly. After finalizing the legal paperwork, I walked the 6 blocks to Rossi's for the evening shift. My parents were meeting with the Carlyle Group representatives at that very moment, likely toasting their impending windfall. They'd asked me to manage the restaurant, tonight claiming they had personal obligations. More lies. I entered through the kitchen, checking in with staff, tasting the day's specials, reviewing reservations. The familiar rhythm of pre-service preparations soothed me, grounding me in the reality of the business they thought was just numbers on a page. "Marco," called Uncle Tony from the office doorway, his unexpected presence immediately setting me on edge. "Got a minute?" I followed him into the small office, noting the scattered papers on the desk. Had he found something? Did he suspect? "Your aunt isn't feeling well, so I thought I'd help out tonight," he explained, settling into my father's chair. "Anything I should know about this evening's service?" I relaxed slightly. "Just the usual Thursday crowd. We're fully booked by 30. He nodded, then fixed me with a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Your father tells me you've been working on some expansion ideas. Ambitious stuff." My pulse quickened. Was this a test? "Just thinking about the future," I replied carefully. Tony studied me for a moment longer. "You know, I always told your father you had good instincts for this business. Better than his sometimes." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Stubborn man, my brother." I remained silent, unsure where this was heading. "Just wanted you to know," he added, turning back to the papers. "Not everyone thought you were too young." The unexpected words caught me off guard, cracking the armor I'd carefully constructed. For a brief moment, I considered confiding in him, sharing my plan, seeking an ally. Then I remembered his voice at Vitelli's. "The kid doesn't have the killer instinct." "Thanks, Uncle Tony," I replied, my resolve hardening once more. "That means a lot." He had no idea just how much killer instinct I really had. But he would. Soon enough, they all would. Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Lincoln Park had been a tradition since I moved into my own apartment 6 years ago. No matter how busy the restaurant was, how exhausted we all felt, we gathered around Mom's dining table at 3 p.m. sharp. Family comes first. That's what my father always preached. The irony wasn't lost on me as I parked my car outside their brownstone, knowing what would unfold in the coming week. The 10-day exclusivity period with Carlisle ended yesterday. Tomorrow morning, Horizon's offer would land on my parents' desks like a grenade. Marco. My mother pulled me into a tight embrace as I entered, the scent of her familiar perfume bringing an unexpected wave of nostalgia. You're looking thin. Are you eating properly? I'm fine, Mom, I replied, following her through the hallway lined with family photos. There I was at 5, standing on a step stool to reach the pasta machine. At 12, proudly holding my first handmade pizza. At 18, in my cap and gown, my father's arm around my shoulders, his pride seemingly genuine. Had it all been preparation for their retirement plan? Had they always seen me as their exit strategy but never their successor? My father sat in his usual armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what looked like contracts. The Carlisle paperwork, most likely. He quickly shuffled them into a folder when he saw me. There he is, he announced, standing to clasp my shoulder. The hardest working man in Chicago. How was last night's service? Record sales, I reported automatically. Eliza's new spring menu is a hit. That woman and her fancy ideas, my father muttered, though there was less bite in his criticism than usual. The impending sale must have mellowed him. You know, your mother's gnocchi would outshine her modern concoctions any day. Robert, my mother chided gently. Not everyone wants to eat the same dishes for 40 years. Marco understands what today's customers want. This concession, small as it was, would have thrilled me a week ago. Now it just felt hollow. Speaking of understanding customers, I ventured, carefully steering the conversation. I've been looking at those demographics reports for our South Loop location. The lunch crowd has shifted considerably in the past year. My father waved dismissively. No need to worry about those details now, son. Of course he needs to worry, Uncle Tony countered, emerging from the kitchen with a glass of my father's prized Barolo. The boy runs the place day to day. He should know these things. The undercurrent of tension between them was subtle but unmistakable. Had my uncle argued against the sale, or merely against keeping me in the dark? Actually, my father said, his tone softening as he placed a hand on my shoulder, I've been meaning to talk to you about some exciting developments. Here it comes, I thought, bracing myself for more lies. A restaurant group has approached us. With an interest in Rossi's, he began, his rehearsed casualness transparent to me now. Very preliminary discussions, nothing concrete, but they see the potential in what we've built. What we've built. As if my contributions were indistinguishable from his. That sounds promising, I replied, matching his casual tone. Which group? Carlisle. They operate those upscale steakhouses downtown, he explained, watching me carefully. They're primarily interested in our brand and recipes, our authentic Italian heritage. My mother bustled in from the kitchen, carrying a platter of antipasti. Enough business talk. It's Sunday. As we moved to the dining table, I noticed new artwork on the walls, designer place settings that hadn't been there last month, subtle signs of spending that contradicted their narrative of tight margins and careful budgeting. Have you been redecorating, Mom? I asked innocently. Just a few small touches, she replied, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. That painting was on sale. The $3,000 original oil painting I'd seen at Galleria d'Arte last month had not been on sale. Another lie. Throughout the meal, I played my part, the dutiful son, enthusiastic about the restaurant's daily operations, oblivious to their larger machinations. I asked about their recent business conference in Palm Springs. which Facebook had revealed was actually a luxury golf resort vacation. They spun elaborate tales about seminars and networking that never happened. "And what about you, Marco?" my father asked as my mother served espresso and tiramisu. "Any exciting developments in your life? Maybe a girlfriend finally?" The familiar dig at my perpetual singleness, a status directly resulting from my devotion to their business, landed differently now. "Actually, I've been exploring some new opportunities," I replied truthfully. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Oh? What kind of opportunities?" "Just considering my options," I said vaguely. "Thinking about the future." "You're not planning to leave Rossi's, are you?" My mother's concern seemed genuine, though I now understood it differently. Not worry for me, but for their plans. They needed me in place until the sale closed. "I'm just making sure I'm positioned for whatever comes next," I assured her, the double meaning clear only to me. My father nodded approvingly. "Smart boy. Always good to have options." He had no idea just how many options I'd created for myself as the dinner wound down. My father pulled me aside, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Listen, Marco, about that restaurant group I mentioned. They might want to meet with you soon to discuss continuity." The audacity nearly made me laugh. They were setting me up for the meeting where I'd be fired or demoted. I'd be happy to meet with them, I replied honestly. "That's my boy," he said, patting my back. "Always a team player." Team. As if we'd ever been on the same side. Later, as I prepared to leave, my mother pressed a container of leftovers into my hands. "You work too hard," she said, genuine affection in her eyes. "We worry about you." For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Had I misunderstood? Was there some explanation that would make sense of their deception? Then my father appeared beside her, his arm around her waist. "By the way, we should grab lunch tomorrow. There are some financial details about the restaurant I want to discuss with you." After 5 years of running their business, after proving myself in every possible way, they were finally ready to discuss some financial details, only because they were about to sell out from under me. "Actually, I have a meeting downtown tomorrow," I said, thinking of the Horizon Partners offer that would be delivered to their lawyer at 9 a.m. sharp. "Maybe later in the week?" Sure, my father agreed easily. No rush, because they thought they had it all figured out. They thought their son was too inexperienced to see through them, too loyal to challenge them, too dependent to stand against them. They had no idea what was coming. Monday morning dawned with a strange, electric clarity. I woke before my alarm, the weight of anticipation making sleep impossible. By 6:30 a.m., I was already at Intelligentsia, nursing my second espresso and watching the city wake up through the cafe's plate glass windows. My phone sat on the table, screen up, ringer on maximum volume. At precisely 9:02 a.m., it rang. "Marco Rossi," I answered, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Marco, it's Sandra. The offer has been delivered to your parents' attorney and their broker. We included the documentation asserting your 5% ownership stake and the requirement for your consent in any sale transaction." I closed my eyes briefly, visualizing the scene that would unfold when my parents received the news. Any immediate response? Not yet, but I wouldn't expect one for at least a few hours. Their legal team will need time to review everything and consult with them. "Thank you, Sandra. Keep me posted." I ended the call, staring at my reflection in the cafe window. The same face that had looked back at me countless mornings before long shifts at Rossi's. But today it belonged to someone different. Someone who had finally stepped out of the shadows of expectation and obligation. At 10:17 a.m., my father called. I let it ring through to voicemail. At 10:18 a.m., my mother called. I declined. At 10:22 a.m., Uncle Tony called. I silenced that too. By 11 a.m., I had 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, and 4 voicemails. I listened to them in sequence, tracking the evolution from confusion to disbelief to fury. "Marco, call me immediately. There's been some kind of mistake." My father's voice, controlled but strained. "Honey, we need to talk. Please call us back." My mother, trying for concern but unable to mask the panic. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My father again, anger breaking through. "This is insane. This is our business. Our business." "Marco, it's Tony. Whatever this is, we can work it out. But you need to call your father before he has a coronary." I forwarded the voicemails to Sandra, evidence of their initial reactions. Then I texted my sister. "It's done. Offer delivered." Her reply came instantly. "Holy shit. How are you feeling?" I considered the question carefully, not vindictive, not triumphant, just resolved. Like I'm finally playing by their rules instead of mine, I replied. At 2:30 p.m., I walked into Rossi's South Loop location for my regular Monday inventory check. The staff moved with their usual efficiency, unaware of the corporate drama unfolding. I nodded to Miguel prepping vegetables at his station, complimented Anna on her flawless tiramisu, discussed wine pairings with Theo. This, the daily rhythms of the restaurant, the team we'd built, the excellence we'd cultivated. This was what mattered. This was what I was fighting for. "Marco." Eliza appeared beside me, her chef's whites immaculate as always. "Your father's in the office." "He looks not good." I nodded, unsurprised. "Thanks for the warning." "Whatever's happening," she said quietly, "we've got your back." The knowledge fortified me as I made my way to the small manager's office tucked behind the bar. My father sat, in my chair, his face ashen, hands clutching a manila folder I recognized as the Horizon offer. "Close the door?" he said, his voice eerily calm. I did, then leaned against the wall, making no move to sit. Power dynamics mattered in moments like this. "Explain this." He tossed the folder onto the desk. "It's a purchase offer," I replied simply. "Horizon Partners is prepared to acquire Rossi's restaurant group for $7.8 million. That's $800,000 more than Carlyle's offer." His eyes narrowed. "You know that's not what I'm asking. How did you know about Carlyle? How did you arrange this? Competing offer? And what's this nonsense about you owning 5% of my company?" "Your company?" I repeated, maintaining my composure. "Grandpa Rossi's company, technically. And he structured it very specifically to include future generations. I've met the conditions for 5 years now. We never formally transferred those shares. That's not how it works, Dad. The corporate documents are clear. The shares transfer automatically upon meeting the conditions. I've been a shareholder for years, whether you acknowledged it or not." He stood abruptly, color returning to his face in angry blotches. "This is how you repay us? After everything we've done for you? We gave you a job, taught you the business. You used me." I interrupted, my voice still calm but firm. "You underpaid. Me by at least 40% while I worked 80-hour weeks. You lied about the financial state of the business to keep me hungry. You planned to sell to strangers without ever giving me a real chance to take over. You weren't ready. That wasn't your decision to make anymore," I countered. "I earned my place. I proved myself 1,000 times over. But you were never going to see it because you needed to believe I was still a child who couldn't manage without you." He paced the small office, agitation making his movements jerky. "And now what? You think you can just take our legacy? Our life's work?" "Your legacy was secure with me," I said quietly. "I never wanted to change what makes Rossi special. I wanted to build on it, grow it, honor it. You're the ones who were willing to sell to corporate strangers who had got everything that matters except the name. We were retiring. You deserved a comfortable retirement, absolutely. And you would have had it if you'd transitioned. Leadership to me as planned. Instead, you went behind my back, lied to my face, and were prepared to leave me with nothing. He stopped pacing suddenly, studying me with new eyes. The anger remained, but there was something else now. A reluctant recognition. "How did you find out?" "You pocket-dialed me," I said, watching realization dawn on his face. "During your meeting with Carlyle at Vitelli's, I heard everything. The jokes about keeping me in the dark, the plans to protect yourselves with a non-compete while leaving me exposed, Mom's comments about me being too emotional about the business." The blood drained from his face again. "Marco, we were just—" "Save it." I cut him off. "The offer on the table is more than fair. Horizon is committed to preserving the Rossi's heritage and keeping our team intact. The choice is simple. You can accept a better offer than you already have, or you can fight me in court over my shareholder rights and watch the Carlyle deal collapse in the meantime." "You'd sue your own family?" His voice was incredulous. "You were going to sell out your own son," I replied evenly. "We've both learned where the boundaries of family loyalty lie." He sank back into the chair, suddenly looking his age. "Your mother is devastated." "Mom will be fine with an extra $800,000 for her retirement," I said, unmoved by the guilt tactic that would have worked so effectively a week ago. "But if you'd like, I can explain my reasoning to her directly." "That won't be necessary," he said quickly, protectiveness flashing in his eyes. "I'll discuss the offer with her and Tony." I nodded, moving toward the door. "You have until Friday to decide. After that, Horizon's offer expires, and I file for the injunction against the Carlyle sale." As I reached for the doorknob, his voice stopped me. "Was any of it real for you? The family business? Or was it just a stepping stone to this corporate takeover?" The question hit harder than I expected, piercing through my carefully constructed armor. I turned back to face him. "It was everything to me," I said, my voice finally betraying emotion. "That's why it hurts so much to hear you laugh about deceiving me. That's why I'm fighting to keep it now." I left him sitting there, surrounded by the consequences of his own deception, and walked back into the restaurant that might finally, rightfully become mine. Tuesday morning brought no resolution, only eerie silence from my family. I spent the day at the original Rossi's location, diving into work with focused intensity, the familiar routine offering comfort amid the chaos of my personal life. Staff members cast curious glances my way, sensing something had shifted but unsure what. Only Eliza knew the full story, and she maintained a protective presence in the kitchen, deflecting questions and keeping operations running smoothly. By Wednesday afternoon, the silence became unbearable. I called Alyssa for perspective. "Still." "Nothing?" she asked, the sound of architectural drafting tools clinking in the background. "Not a word," I confirmed, pacing my apartment balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. "Sandra says their lawyer requested additional documentation about my ownership stake, but that's it. No counteroffer, no acceptance, no rejection." "They're stalling," Alyssa concluded, "trying to figure out if there's a way around your shareholder rights." "There isn't," I said with confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Sandra's firm has handled dozens of similar cases. The precedent is clear." "This isn't just about legal precedent, Marco. It's about Mom and Dad's entire worldview crumbling. They've always seen themselves as the decision-makers, the providers, the ones in control. You've flipped that narrative overnight." Her words gave me pause. "I never wanted to hurt them, Ailey. I just wanted what I earned." "I know," she said softly, "but they might not be able to separate those things." After we hung up, I scrolled through my photo gallery, stopping on an image from last Christmas. My parents flanking me at the restaurant's holiday party, their arms around my shoulders, smiles wide and seemingly genuine. Had it all been a performance? Or was there real pride beneath the surface? Pride I'd never fully recognized because I was too busy trying to prove myself worthy of their approval. Thursday brought a break in the stalemate. Uncle Tony called just after the lunch service ended. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Not at the restaurant? Not at your parents' house? Neutral ground. We agreed to meet at Millennium Park near the Bean, a location public enough to discourage emotional outbursts, but private enough for honest conversation. Tony was already waiting when I arrived, sitting on a bench with his hands stuffed in his coat pockets against the early spring chill. At 62, he looked older than his years today, the lines in his face deeper, his shoulders hunched with invisible weight. Your father hasn't slept in 3 days, he began as I sat beside him. Your mother keeps bursting into tears at random moments. Is that what you wanted? You know it's not, I replied, refusing to accept the guilt trip. I wanted recognition. I wanted the chance I earned. They were going to sell without even discussing it with me first. Tony sighed heavily. Your father has always had a blind spot when it comes to you. He sees you as perpetually 17, passionate but impulsive, smart but naive. I'm 28, Tony. I've been running those restaurants for years while he played golf and plotted his exit strategy. I know, he acknowledged, surprising me. I told him he was making a mistake not bringing you into the Carlisle discussions. But Robert, he convinced himself it was for your own good, that you'd be devastated if the deal fell through, that you weren't ready for the disappointment if it didn't work out. That wasn't his decision to make, I said, the familiar frustration, rising. And it certainly wasn't his place to decide my future without my input. Tony nodded slowly. No arguments there. But this counter-move of yours, it's forced everyone into corners. Your father feels betrayed. Your mother feels like she's losing her son. The family is fracturing, Marco. They fractured it first, I said quietly. The night I heard them laughing about keeping me in the dark, about treating me like an ATM with legs, they broke something that can't be easily repaired. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching tourists pose for photos against the Chicago skyline. Finally, Tony turned to face me directly. What do you really want out of this, Marco? Is it revenge? Control? Or is it the restaurants themselves? The question cut through the emotional haze of the past 2 weeks. I want what was promised to me, I said after a moment. The chance to lead Rossi's into the future. The opportunity to build on what Grandpa started, what Dad and you grew. I want to honor our heritage while creating something new. I want your birthright, Tony finished for me. I nodded, unexpected emotion tightening my throat. Then perhaps, there's a solution, he said cautiously. Your father is too proud to suggest it, which is why I'm here instead. I'm listening. A family buyout, Tony proposed. No Carlisle, no Horizon. You buy your father's and my shares directly over time. We finance part of the purchase, giving you manageable payments while providing us retirement income. I considered the suggestion carefully. And operational control? Immediate and complete, Tony confirmed. We stepped back entirely. Why would Dad agree to this now, when he wouldn't even discuss succession planning before? Tony's laugh held no humor. Because you've backed him into a corner, kid. Because you've proven you're not just talk. You're action. Because you've shown him you're willing to fight for what's yours with every weapon at your disposal. He paused, genuine admiration flickering in his eyes. You've shown him you're a Rossi through and through. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had to become my father, strategic, unflinching, willing to leverage every advantage, to make him finally see me as worthy of the family legacy. I'll need to discuss this with my advisors, I said, unwilling to commit on the spot. Of course, Tony agreed. But consider this, Marco. Do you want to run Rossi's with the shadow of this conflict hanging over everything? Do you want the staff taking sides, the customers sensing tension, the food critics writing about family drama instead of cuisine? A clean transition preserves what matters most, the business itself. His words resonated more than I wanted to admit. The restaurants were what I'd been fighting for all along. Not just ownership, but the soul of Rossi's. The recipes passed, down through generations. The hospitality that made regulars feel like family. The excellence that had built our reputation over decades. "I'll have an answer by tomorrow," I promised, standing to leave. Tony nodded, remaining seated. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know something," he said, his voice gruff with uncharacteristic emotion. "I always believed you were the future of Rossi's. Always." I studied him for a moment, wondering if this was just another manipulation. But his eyes held steady, and I recognized the truth in them. "Then why didn't you stop them?" I asked, the question that had been burning inside me. "Because some lessons can't be taught, Marco. Some things you have to claim for yourself." He gestured to the city around us. "And you just did." That night, I gathered my advisors at my apartment: Sandra, my attorney, James from Horizon, and Eliza, who understood the soul of Rossi's as well as I did. Wine flowed as we dissected Uncle Tony's proposal, weighing it against the Horizon partnership that had been my salvation just days ago. "Financially, the family financing option makes sense," Sandra acknowledged, reviewing the rough terms Tony had emailed over. "Lower upfront capital requirements, no outside equity dilution, potentially lower overall cost. But substantially higher risk," James countered, swirling his Barolo pensively. "If the business underperforms, you'll still be on the hook for those payments to your family. With our structure, you'd have a partner sharing that risk. And sharing control," I pointed out. "The family option gives me complete autonomy from day one." Eliza, who had been quiet for most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "Which matters more to you, Marco? Proving something to your family, or building something for yourself?" The question silenced the room. I stood and walked to my window, looking out at the city lights twinkling against the darkness. When I started this, it was about justice, about not letting them take away what I'd earned. I turned back to face my advisors. But now, it's about the future, about what Rossi's can become. "And what is that?" Eliza pressed. I described the vision I'd been refining for years, expanding our cooking class program into a full culinary school focusing on traditional Italian techniques, launching a line of premium sauces and pastas for retail, opening a third location with an innovative format combining restaurant, market, and interactive dining experiences. Ideas my father had dismissed as fantasies. "That's ambitious," Sandra observed. "Will your parents support that vision if they're essentially your lenders?" "They won't have a say," I insisted. "Operational control has to be complete and unconditional." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marco, from a purely business perspective, our offer remains superior. But I've known you long enough to recognize there's more at stake here than financials." He glanced at the photos on my bookshelf. My grandfather opening the original Rossi's in 1978. My 5-year-old self making my first pizza. 4 generations of Rossi men at my college graduation. Family businesses are complicated. What looks like the right financial decision on paper isn't always right for the people involved. By midnight, after they had all left, I had my answer. I called Tony, despite the late hour. "I'll accept the family buyout with conditions," I told him, my voice steady with conviction. "Complete operational control from day one. No interference in business decisions. A 10-year payment schedule with reasonable interest. And one more thing. Mom's recipes become formal company intellectual property, documented and preserved." Tony's chuckle carried through the phone. "Already drafted and ready for signatures. Your father may be stubborn, but he's not stupid. He knew what you'd need." The next morning, I arrived at my parents' house at precisely 9 a.m. The familiar brownstone looked unchanged, but everything else had transformed. My mother opened the door, her expression a complex mixture of hurt, resignation, and something that might have been pride. "He's in the study," she said simply, stepping aside to let me enter. My father sat behind his mahogany desk, papers arrayed neatly before him, reading glasses perched on his nose. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't offer a handshake or greeting, just gestured to the chair across from him. "Tony says you've agreed to the family buyout," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "In principle," I confirmed, maintaining the same professional tone. "Subject to final review of terms." He pushed a folder toward me. "It's all there. Transfer of operational control effective immediately. Payment schedule over 10 years. Interest at 2 points below prime. Your name as president and CEO of Rossi's restaurant group as of today." I opened the folder, scanning the documents. Everything appeared as discussed, straightforward and clean. Too straightforward, almost. I looked up to find my father watching me intently. "No hidden clauses?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. "No consulting roles? No veto rights over major decisions?" Something flashed in my father's eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or resignation. "No tricks, Marco. You've made it abundantly clear you don't. Trust us. I wouldn't insult you by trying to sneak something past you now." I continued reading, searching for loopholes but finding none. The agreement was everything I'd asked for. Complete control, reasonable terms, clean break from day to day, involvement for my parents and uncle. "Why the change of heart?" I finally asked, looking directly at my father. "A week ago you were ready to sell to strangers and push me out completely." He removed his reading glasses, suddenly looking much older than his 65 years. "You want the truth? I didn't think you had it in you." "Had what?" "The killer instinct," he said bluntly. "The ruthlessness this business sometimes requires. The willingness to do whatever it takes to protect what's yours." I stared at him, understanding, dawning slowly. So all of this, the secret negotiations, the lies, the dismissal of my ideas, it was some kind of test? He barked a short, humorless laugh. "No. God, no. I genuinely thought Carlisle was the right move. I genuinely believed you weren't ready." He paused, meeting my eyes directly. "But when you orchestrated that competing offer, when you asserted your ownership rights, when you were willing to take us to court if necessary, you showed me something I hadn't seen before." "That I'm like you," I said, the realization both uncomfortable and oddly satisfying. "That you're a Rossi," he corrected. "That you'll fight for what matters with everything you have. It's what my father did when he saved for 20 years to open the first restaurant. It's what I did when the city tried to condemn our building in '96. And it's what you did this past week." My mother appeared in the doorway, a tray of espresso in her hands, a peace offering of sorts. "Your father isn't good with words," she said, setting the tray on the desk. "What he's trying to say is that we're proud of you, Marco. Not for how you did it, but for what you proved." "And what's that?" I asked, accepting a small cup from her. "That you love Rossi's enough to fight for it," she said simply. "That it means as much to you as it does to us." I sipped the espresso, perfect as always, bitter and sweet simultaneously, like the moment itself. "It does," I confirmed. "It always has." My father pushed a pen toward me, his hand steady. "Then it's yours now. Build it into whatever you think it should become." I hesitated, pen hovering over the signature line. "And you won't interfere? Won't criticize when I implement changes? Won't undermine me with the staff?" "We'll bite our tongues until they bleed, if necessary," my mother promised with unexpected fierceness. This transition was messy, painful for everyone, but it's done now. Time to heal and move forward. I signed the document slowly, deliberately, the weight of the moment not lost on me. With each signature, generations of Rossi history and future transferred to my keeping. When I finished, I slid the folder back across the desk. "It's done," my father said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely displayed. He stood and extended his hand formally. "Congratulations, Mr. President." I rose and took his hand, but then pulled him into an embrace instead. Our first in years. I won't let you down, I promised, speaking to him but also to my grandfather, to the legacy itself. I know, he said gruffly, patting my back awkwardly before stepping away. You never have. As I left their house that morning, ownership documents tucked securely under my arm, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and reconciliation. I had won, but not in the way I'd imagined. The business was mine, but so was the responsibility, to my family's legacy, to our staff, to the future I'd fought. So hard to claim. My phone chimed with a text from Eliza. Well? I typed back a simple response. It's done. Family buyout approved. I'm officially CEO as of today. Her reply came instantly. Congratulations, boss. Now the real work begins. She was right, of course. I'd won the battle for control, but the challenge of living up to that responsibility, of transforming Rossi's while honoring its heritage, of proving my parents' newfound faith in me wasn't misplaced. That journey was just beginning. And for the first time in years, I felt truly ready for it. The first day as official owner of Rossi's began with a moment of quiet reflection. I arrived at the original location before dawn, using my key to enter the darkened restaurant. The space felt different somehow. The dining room with its checkered tablecloths and vintage photos of Italy, the polished bar where my grandfather had served his first customers, the kitchen where 3 generations of my family had created culinary magic. It was all the same, yet transformed by my new relationship to it. I ran my hand along the smooth marble countertop of the bar, remembering countless evenings watching my father charm customers with stories of the old country. For all his flaws, he had been a magnificent host, warm, attentive, making every guest feel like family. That was something I needed to preserve, even as other aspects of the business evolved. Thought I might find you here, came Eliza's voice, from the kitchen doorway. She flipped on the lights, illuminating the space we both loved. Couldn't sleep? Too many ideas, I admitted, showing her the notebook filled with scribbled plans I'd made through the night. Now that I can actually implement them, my brain won't shut off, she smiled, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. So, what's first on the agenda, Mr. CEO? Staff meeting, I replied without hesitation. Everyone needs to hear about the transition directly from me before rumors start flying. Then I need to call James and gracefully exit the Horizon deal. And your parents? Dad's agreed to announce his retirement at a small industry dinner next week. We'll frame it as a planned succession, downplay any hint of conflict. The story we'd crafted would save face for everyone. My parents could claim they'd been grooming me all along, and I could take the reins without the shadow of family drama tainting Rossi's reputation. By 10 a.m., I'd gathered the full staff from both locations in the main dining room. Servers, line cooks, hosts, dishwashers, bartenders. 37 people whose livelihoods now depended on my leadership. Some looked curious, others anxious. Most had heard whispers about potential changes, but nothing concrete. Thank you all. For coming in early, I began, standing before them with a new authority that felt both foreign and natural. I have important news to share. After 40 years of building Rossi's into what it is today, my father has decided to retire. A murmur rippled through the group. Not entirely surprising given my father's age, but still significant. As part of this transition, I've purchased my family's ownership stakes. Effective immediately, I am the owner and CEO of Rossi's Restaurant Group. The reaction was mixed. Smiles from those who had worked closely with me, uncertainty from others who had primarily reported to my father, whispered conversations in Spanish and Italian among the kitchen staff, trying to process what this meant for them. I know change can be unsettling, I continued, addressing their unspoken concerns. So, let me be clear about what isn't changing. Our commitment to quality, to authentic Italian cuisine, to treating our staff and customers like family. Those values remain non-negotiable. Relief visibly washed over several faces. What will change is how we grow and evolve. In the coming weeks, I'll be meeting with each department to discuss new initiatives, expanding our cooking class program, launching retail products, exploring a third location concept. Miguel, our head prep cook who had been with us for 15 years, raised his hand tentatively. Will your father still be around? He knows many of our regulars. He'll transition to an ambassador role, I explained, using the diplomatic term we'd agreed upon. Attending special events, maintaining relationships with longtime customers, but no longer involved in daily operations. Anna, our pastry chef, spoke up next. And your mother's recipes? The tiramisu, the cannoli, those aren't changing, right? Her concern was legitimate. My mother's desserts had developed a cult following over 4 decades. Those recipes are now officially documented as company assets, I assured her. They remain exactly as they've always been. What I didn't add was how hard I'd had to push for that documentation. My mother had always kept her recipes in her head, a power move that made her indispensable. Questions continued for nearly an hour about job security, potential promotions, expansion plans. I answered each honestly, sharing my vision while acknowledging that some details were still taking shape. By the time the meeting concluded, the initial anxiety had largely transformed into cautious optimism. That went well, Eliza observed as the staff dispersed to prepare for lunch service. Better than expected, I agreed. But the real test comes in execution. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of activity. I negotiated an amicable withdrawal from the Horizon deal, explaining to James that the family solution ultimately preserved what mattered most to me. He was disappointed but understood, even offering to keep the door open for future partnership opportunities if my expansion plans required additional capital. My father's retirement dinner at the Chicago Culinary Guild became the talk of the key restaurant community. He played his role perfectly, the proud patriarch passing the torch to his well-prepared son, conveniently omitting the messy reality of how that transition had actually occurred. We smiled for photographs, accepted congratulations, and maintained the united front we'd agreed upon. "You're doing a good job," he told me gruffly as we stood at the bar after most guests had departed. It wasn't effusive praise, but from Robert. "Rossi, it was significant." "I learned from watching you," I replied, offering the olive branch we both needed. Whatever had happened, he had built something remarkable, and that deserved acknowledgement. He nodded, a hint of genuine emotion breaking through his usual stoicism. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the restaurant should stay in family hands." "It has," I assured him, "and it will." The most challenging conversation came the following Sunday at my parents' house. Our first family dinner since the ownership transfer carried an undercurrent of tension beneath the polite conversation. As my mother served her famous ossobuco, I broached the subject we'd been dancing around. "I'd like to document the complete recipe collection," I said carefully. "Not just the desserts, but everything. The ragu that takes 3 days, the special seasoning blend for the veal, all of it." My mother's spoon clattered against the serving dish. "Those recipes are in my head where they belong. They're Rossi family assets now," I countered gently. "What if something happened to you? Those traditions would be lost." "Nothing is going to happen to me," she insisted, the familiar stubbornness emerging. My father surprised me by intervening. "Elena, the boy is right. It's time. We can't take it all with us." She looked between us, perhaps recognizing for the first time that the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. "Fine," she conceded finally. "But I will supervise every detail of the documentation. Some things can't be captured in measurements alone." "I wouldn't have it any other way," I agreed quickly, knowing this was a significant victory in the ongoing negotiation of our new relationships. By the end of the month, I had established a rhythm. Early mornings reviewing finances and planning strategic initiatives. Days split between both locations overseeing operations. evenings experimenting with new menu concepts alongside Eliza. The staff had embraced the transition fully once they realized their jobs were secure and their input valued. My first major initiative, an expanded cooking class program that would operate during off hours in the main restaurant, launched to immediate success. Local food bloggers praised the authentic Italian immersion experience, and within weeks we had waiting lists for every session. The retail product line proved more complicated, requiring FDA approvals and packaging design, but by month 3, the first batch of Rossi's premium pasta sauces was ready for market testing. Seeing our family name on those jars, elegant black labels with gold lettering, brought an unexpected surge of emotion. This was what I'd fought for, the chance to build something new while honoring what came before. Not bad for someone who was too young to run things, Alyssa teased during her visit from Seattle, inspecting one of the sauce jars with obvious pride. I had something to prove, I admitted, pouring us both a glass of Montepulciano. And now? She asked, studying me carefully. I considered the question, looking around the restaurant that was finally, truly, mine. Now I have something to build. 6 months into my ownership, the financial statements spread across my desk told a story of transformation. Revenue was up 22% across both locations. The cooking class program had expanded to 5 nights a week, consistently selling out. Our retail sauce line had secured placement in 12 specialty grocers across Chicago, with negotiations underway for wider distribution. These victories should have felt sweeter than they did, but success carried a bittersweet edge as my relationship with my parents remained strained. Our weekly Sunday dinners had become formal, stilted affairs. My father, once domineering and opinionated about every aspect of the business, now carefully avoided any mention of Rossi's. My mother dutifully documented her recipes, but did so with a mechanical precision that lacked her usual passion. They're adjusting, Alyssa reassured me during our weekly phone calls. It's not easy to hand over something you've built from nothing. They didn't hand it over, I reminded her. I had to take it. The reminder hung between us, uncomfortable, but true. Despite the carefully crafted public narrative of a planned succession, the reality remained. I had forced my parents' hand through legal maneuvering and strategic leverage. The ends might justify the means, but the cost to our family dynamic was real. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I sat in the empty dining room reviewing applications for the general manager position at our proposed 3rd location. We'd secured a space in Wicker Park, a historic building with high ceilings and exposed brick walls that perfectly balanced rustic charm with urban sophistication. The concept would be different from our existing restaurants, part traditional, dining, part retail market, part interactive experience, a testing ground for ideas that might eventually refresh our flagship locations. The sound of the front door opening drew my attention. My father stood in the entryway, rain dripping from his overcoat, looking somehow diminished in the restaurant that had once been his domain. "Dad," I said, rising quickly. I wasn't expecting you. "Clearly," he replied, glancing at the papers spread across the table. "You're busy. I can come back." "No, stay," I insisted, gathering the applications into a neat stack. "What brings you by?" He removed his coat, hanging it by the door with the practiced motion of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times. "Your mother mentioned you're moving forward with the Wicker Park location." I nodded cautiously, unsure where this was heading. "The lease is signed. We begin renovations next month." "Good area," he observed, moving further into the dining room, his eyes scanning the space as if seeing it anew. "Strong foot traffic, growing residential population, not oversaturated with Italian concepts yet." That was my assessment too, I agreed, surprised by his businesslike evaluation. He nodded, then fell silent, running his hand along the back of a dining chair. the gesture so familiar it made my chest tighten. How many times had I watched him patrol the dining room this way before service, checking every detail with meticulous precision? I drove by the site yesterday, he finally continued. The building has good bones. Those arched windows will be spectacular when properly restored. I studied him, trying to decipher his purpose. Was this a peace offering? A critique? An attempt to reassert influence? We're keeping as many original elements as possible, I explained. The architectural details are part of what makes it special. He nodded again, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a folded piece of paper. I thought you might find this useful. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward me. Just some observations. I unfolded the paper to find a meticulously drawn floor plan, not architectural quality, but remarkably detailed. Notes in my father's precise handwriting indicated traffic flow patterns, optimal table placement, kitchen workflow considerations. You drew this? I asked, genuinely impressed. I've opened a few restaurants in my time, he replied with a hint of his old confidence. These old buildings have quirks. That support column in the center will create visibility issues. You'll want to adjust your station layout accordingly. I studied the drawing more carefully, recognizing immediately that he'd identified several potential problems our architects had missed. This is incredibly helpful. Thank you. Something shifted. In his expression, a subtle softening, a flash of the mentor he could have been all along if pride hadn't stood in the way. I made plenty of expensive mistakes when I was starting out. No reason for you to repeat them. The simple statement carried layers of meaning, an acknowledgement that I was now walking a path he once traveled, a recognition that my success didn't diminish his legacy, but extended it. I'd value your input on the layout, I said carefully, testing the boundaries of this fragile new dynamic. If you're willing to consult, he repeated, a wry smile touching his lips. Is that what we're calling it now? Professional courtesy between industry colleagues, I suggested, offering the dignity of equal standing rather than the hierarchy of before. He considered this for a moment, then nodded. I could spare some time. In a purely advisory capacity, of course, I agreed, relief washing through me. I'm heading over there tomorrow afternoon if you'd like to join. The next day, we walked the empty space together, my father pointing out details only visible to someone with decades of restaurant experience. The slight slope in the floor that would affect drainage, the placement of support beams that would determine hood ventilation options, the sightlines from the bar that would impact guest experience. I took notes, asking questions when appropriate, pushing back when necessary. We disagreed about the open kitchen concept, he favoring traditional separation, me arguing for transparency and theater. But the discussion remained professional, respectful. For the first time, we were speaking as equals with different perspectives rather than battling for control. You've thought this through, he acknowledged as we concluded the walk-through. The concept is solid. Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. I did learn from watching you, I reminded him, echoing my words from the retirement dinner. Even when we disagreed on methods. He nodded, hands in his pockets as he surveyed the space once more. Your grandfather would have called this reckless, 3 locations before you're 30. Retail products, cooking classes. A pause, then. He would have been wrong. The admission hung in the air between us, not quite an apology for his own similar judgments, but an acknowledgement of their error. Would you and Mom be willing to come to the menu tasting next week? I asked, extending the olive branch further. Eliza has some ideas for dishes that honor traditional recipes while incorporating modern techniques. We could use experienced palates. He hesitated only briefly. I think we could arrange that. 2 weeks later, my parents sat at the chef's table in our South Loop kitchen, sampling Eliza's creations for the new location. My mother's critical eye hadn't softened. She immediately noted that the carbonara wasn't quite authentic, but her feedback was constructive rather than dismissive. "The pancetta should be crispier," she instructed, demonstrating the exact texture with her fork. "But the addition of those wild mushrooms, that's inspired. Not traditional, but good." Eliza beamed at the qualified praise. "We're trying to respect tradition while creating something new. It's a delicate balance." "Like family businesses," my father observed quietly, meeting my eyes across the table, honoring what came before while building what comes next. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it was sincere. A recognition that perhaps my vision for Rossi's future didn't have to erase its past. "To balance," I proposed, raising my wine glass. "To Rossi's," my father countered, lifting his own. My mother joined the toast, adding softly, "To family." We clinked glasses, the sound crystalline and hopeful in the busy kitchen. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet. But perhaps the beginning of a new recipe, one we were creating together. 1 year to the day after I discovered my parents' plan to sell Rossi's, I stood in the gleaming new kitchen of our Wicker Park location. The renovation had transformed the historic building into something that honored its past while embracing a bold future, much like Rossi's itself. Subway tile in our signature deep green covered the walls, copper pots hung from a custom rack above the central island, and state-of-the-art equipment hummed with potential energy. Through the large pass-through window, I could see staff arranging tables in the dining room, placing hand-rolled beeswax candles in antique Italian wine bottles. "We're really doing this," Eliza said, appearing beside me. Her chef's coat bore the new Rossi's logo, a subtle redesign that maintained the classic script while adding a modern flourish. "Opening is tomorrow and we're actually ready." "Ahead of schedule and only slightly over budget," I confirmed, unable to keep the pride from my voice. Not bad for our first build-out. The journey to this moment had been arduous but exhilarating. Sleepless nights reviewing contractor bids, intense negotiations with vendors, carefully balancing innovation with tradition in every aspect, from menu development to interior design. The result was a restaurant that felt unmistakably Rossi's, while offering something entirely new to Chicago's dining scene. "Your father's suggestions about the kitchen layout were spot on," Eliza acknowledged, checking the line setup one final time. "Having the pasta station positioned here instead of against the back wall makes everything flow better." "He knows a thing or two about kitchen functionality," I agreed, remembering the hours my father and I had spent debating equipment placement, workflow patterns, and sightlines. Those conversations, focused on practical details rather than emotional history, had slowly rebuilt a professional rapport between us. My phone buzzed with a text from Alyssa. "Flight landed. We'll drop bags at hotel and head straight to you. Can't wait to see this place." "Reinforcements are arriving," I told Eliza with a smile. "My sister will be here soon and my parents are coming for the private friends and family dinner tonight." She raised an eyebrow. "Your parents and about 50 food critics, influencers, and industry insiders. No pressure." "Just another service," I replied with more confidence than I felt. This opening represented not just a business expansion, but a personal statement, proof that my vision for Rossi's future could succeed on its own merits. The soft opening unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of restaurant debuts. Small hiccups, a temperamental espresso machine, a missing case of specialty glassware, were swiftly addressed. By 7 o'clock, the dining room hummed with conversation and appreciation as guests explored both the space and the innovative. Menu eye moved among the tables, greeting familiar faces from Chicago's culinary community. Introducing our new concept, watching reactions to Eliza's bold interpretations of classic dishes. The market section, where guests could purchase fresh pasta, house-made sauces, and specialty Italian imports, drew particular interest. "This is fantastic, Marco," James Wong enthused, sampling the truffle arancini. Horizon was crazy to let you get away. The integrated retail concept alone is brilliant. Everything in its right time, I replied diplomatically. But I appreciate the vote of confidence. I spotted my parents as they entered. My mother elegant in charcoal silk, my father imposing despite his slightly stooped posture. They paused in the entryway, taking in the restaurant with critical eyes. I excused myself from James and made my way to them, suddenly feeling like the nervous kid who used to seek their approval on school projects. "You came," I said, embracing my mother and shaking my father's hand. "We wouldn't miss it," my mother assured me, though tension lingered in her smile. "The place looks beautiful, Marco. Those light fixtures, are they from Murano?" "Replicas," I admitted. Authentic Murano glass was beyond even our expanded budget. "Smart compromise," my father approved unexpectedly. "Save the big expenses for what guests can taste, not just what they see." The observation, practical, supportive, free of criticism, caught me off guard. "That was exactly my thinking," I acknowledged. "Would you like a tour before you're seated?" I guided them through the restaurant, pointing out features that blended tradition with innovation. The hand-painted tile mural depicting scenes from my grandfather's hometown in Sicily, the custom wood-fired oven imported from Naples, the glass-enclosed pasta-making station where guests could watch our artisans at work. "You've created something special here," my father said as we concluded in the retail section. He picked up a jar of our signature arrabbiata sauce, examining the label with its elegant design. "Expanding the Rossi name beyond restaurant walls, that was always the dream?" "Your dream?" I asked, surprised. "Once upon a time," he admitted, "before the complexities of running 2 locations consumed every waking hour, before I convinced myself that maintenance was enough and growth was too risky." The honesty of his response, the tacit acknowledgement that fear had masqueraded as wisdom in his resistance to my ideas, felt like a gift more valuable than any explicit praise. As they moved toward their table, Alyssa arrived, wrapping me in an enthusiastic hug. "This place is incredible, modern but still so authentically Rossi's." "That was the goal," I confirmed, grateful for her unequivocal support. "Balance, remember?" The meal itself became a milestone in our family's healing process. My mother actually complimented Eliza's reinvention of her treasured recipes, acknowledging the thoughtful innovations while appreciating the preserved foundations. My father asked detailed questions about the business model, not to critique but to understand. We discussed expansion possibilities, market trends, opportunities for growth, professional conversations that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. As dessert arrived, a deconstructed tiramisu that honored my mother's classic recipe, while presenting it in a thoroughly contemporary way, my father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I have been discussing something," he began, an unusual hesitancy in his voice. "We'd like to contribute in some way to the next phase of Rossi's growth." I set down my fork, surprised. "Contribute how?" "Financially," my mother clarified. "The cooking school concept you've been developing, we'd like to invest in it. As silent partners," she added quickly. "No operational involvement." The offer stunned me. After everything that had happened, the deception, the confrontation, the forced transition, they were volunteering to invest in my vision. "We believe in what you're building," my father continued, meeting my gaze directly. "And we'd like to be part of it, not as owners or managers, but as family." The distinction was significant, acknowledging a boundary that would have been unthinkable in our previous dynamic. "I'll need to review the business plan with you," I said carefully. "Make sure the investment structure works for everyone." "Of course," my father agreed immediately. "We'll approach this professionally." "But in principle," my mother added, "are you open to our participation?" I looked around the bustling restaurant, at the staff executing my vision with precision and enthusiasm, at the guests enjoying our reimagined classics, at the Rossi name prominently displayed throughout the space. Everything I'd fought for was now reality. The battle for control had been won decisively. What remained was the opportunity to rebuild something just as valuable: family trust. In principle, I said finally, I think there's nothing more appropriate than the cooking school that will carry forward our traditions being a true family investment. Relief and something like pride washed over their faces. Not the controlling pride of ownership, but the genuine pride of seeing their legacy evolve in unexpected ways. As we raised our glasses in a toast to new beginnings, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, confident, accomplished, no longer seeking validation but standing firmly in my own authority. The journey from underestimated heir to respected owner had transformed not just Rossi's, but me as well. What had begun as a fight for justice had become something more profound, a reclamation of my birthright on my own terms, and the foundation for a new kind of family business, one built on mutual respect rather than obligation, on collaboration rather than control. To the next generation of Rossi's, my father proposed, his voice thick with emotion rarely displayed. To the next generation, I echoed, the words carrying promise rather than burden for the first time. 3 years after buying out my parents, I sat in my office reviewing the quarterly reports for Rossi's restaurant group. The numbers told a story even more remarkable than I had dared to hope. Revenue had tripled across our now 4 locations. The retail product line had expanded to 32 items distributed in specialty stores nationwide. The cooking school, funded in part by my parents' investment, had a 6-month waiting list and had been featured in Food and Wine as one of the country's premier culinary education experiences. Success brought its own challenges, managing rapid growth, maintaining quality across multiple venues, preserving the soul of Rossi's while scaling its operations. But these were good problems, the kind that came from abundance rather than scarcity, from opportunity rather than limitation. A knock at my door interrupted my analysis. Eliza entered, now executive chef across all Rossi's properties, overseeing a team of talented chefs who executed her vision at each location. The James Beard Foundation just called, she announced without preamble. We're finalists for Outstanding Restaurant Group. I leaned back in my chair, momentarily speechless. The James Beard Awards were the Oscars of the culinary world, recognition that went beyond commercial success to acknowledge genuine excellence and innovation. That's incredible, I managed, finally. All those nights debating whether my modern Italian concept would alienate traditionalists. Turns out respect for tradition and embrace of innovation aren't mutually exclusive, Eliza observed with a smile. Who would have thought? The recognition validated the core philosophy that had guided my leadership, honoring Rossi's heritage, while refusing to be constrained by it. The foundation my grandfather and father had built was strong enough to support new structures, flexible enough to accommodate evolution. We should celebrate, I decided, closing the financial reports. Gather the management team for dinner tonight. My treat. Already on it, Eliza confirmed. 7 o'clock at the original location. I've planned a special menu, greatest hits from across all our concepts. As she left, my phone buzzed with a text from Alyssa. Just saw the Beard announcement. Calling Mom and Dad now. So proud of you. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something I wouldn't have recognized 3 years ago. The painful transition of power had given way to a new dynamic, one of mutual respect between professionals who shared blood and history, but now operated in different spheres. My father had embraced his ambassador role, regaling special event, guests with stories of Rossi's early days. My mother had found unexpected fulfillment teaching select courses at our cooking school, passing down traditional techniques to a new generation of culinary enthusiasts. The family dinners that had once been battlegrounds of passive aggression now served as genuine opportunities to connect. We still disagreed, My mother remained convinced that my carbonara recipe used too much black pepper. My father thought our wine list included too many natural wines, but the criticisms came without the undercurrent of control that had previously poisoned our interactions. That evening, as my management team gathered in the private dining room of the original Rossi's, I found myself overcome with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Looking around at these talented professionals who had helped transform my vision into reality, Eliza discussing menu inspiration with our beverage director, Miguel, now chef de cuisine at our downtown location, debating pasta techniques with our newest sous chef, Rachel, our marketing director, showing our retail manager photos from a recent product shoot, I realized what I was feeling: contentment. Not the restless ambition that had driven me to claim my place in the family business. Not the fierce determination that had sustained me through the tumultuous transition. But a deep, settled satisfaction in what we had collectively built. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. My father. I stepped away from the celebration to answer. "Congratulations, son," he said without preamble. "The James Beard nomination is well-deserved." "Thank you," I replied, still slightly surprised by his unqualified praise. "It's a team achievement." Team you built," he pointed out. "A vision you fought for." The acknowledgement that the success stemmed directly from the changes I had implemented, the very innovations he had once dismissed, meant more than any industry recognition. "I learned from watching you," I said, our familiar refrain now carrying layers of meaning beyond its words. "And improved upon it," he added, newfound generosity in his tone. "As it should be." We spoke briefly about the upcoming family dinner. On Sunday, his plans to join a delegation of Italian-American business leaders in a culinary tour of Sicily, my mother's latest cooking class curriculum. Normal conversation between family members who had found their way to mutual respect after years of misalignment. As I rejoined the celebration, my gaze fell on a photograph hanging near the entrance to the private dining room. My grandfather. On opening day in 1978, pride evident in his stance as he stood before the original Rossi's. Beside it hung a newer image, the 4 current Rossi's locations represented in a stylish collage, visual evidence of how far we had come. The juxtaposition reminded me of a truth I had learned through the hardest possible path. Legacy isn't what others hand to you. It's what you claim for yourself, what you build with your own hands, what you earn through your own efforts. 3 years ago, wounded by betrayal and burning with righteous anger, I had orchestrated a takeover of my family's business to prove I was worthy of it. The irony wasn't lost on me that only by taking control without their blessing had I finally earned their respect. Only by charting my own course had I truly honored their legacy. Later that night, after the celebration wound down, I remained at the original restaurant alone, nursing a glass of Barolo in the quiet dining room. This place that had once been my father's domain, then the site of our bitter power struggle, had transformed again into something that belonged uniquely to me while honoring all who had come before. I raised my glass to the empty room, to the ghosts of meals past and the promise of those to come. "To buying what was already mine," I whispered, a toast to the journey that had brought me here, to the betrayal that had catalyzed growth, to the confrontation that had forged resolution, to the hard-won wisdom that sometimes claiming your birthright requires taking matters into your own hands. 5 years to the day after I discovered my parents' plan to sell our family business, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Culinary Institute. The annual Restaurateur of the Year award glinted under the spotlight. A crystal chef's knife mounted on Italian marble, my name freshly engraved on the silver plate. The irony wasn't lost on me that this ceremony fell exactly on the anniversary of the accidental phone call that had changed everything. "This honor belongs to everyone at Rossi's Restaurant Group," I said, looking out at the tables where my team sat, pride evident on their faces. To our chefs who balance tradition and innovation, our servers who make every guest feel like family, our managers who uphold our standards across all locations. In the front row, my parents watched with expressions I once would have found impossible to imagine: genuine pride unmixed with possessiveness, joy uncomplicated by rivalry. My father, now 70, sat straighter as I acknowledged him by name. My mother dabbed at her eyes when I credited her recipes as the foundation of our culinary identity. And finally, I concluded, to my grandfather, Salvatore Rossi, who arrived in Chicago with nothing but a suitcase of recipes and a dream of feeding people the way his mother had fed him. He built something from nothing. My father expanded it, against significant odds. And I've had the privilege of growing it further, standing on their shoulders. The journey from bitter conflict to genuine reconciliation had been neither quick nor straightforward. Each phase of our family's evolution had required its own work, its own reckonings, its own forgiveness, both offered and received. The complete story could never be told publicly. The polished narrative of planned succession and harmonious transition had become the official history. Only those closest to us knew the messy reality, the painful truths that had necessitated radical action. After the ceremony, as waitstaff cleared dessert plates and guests mingled over digestives, James Wong approached our table. 5 years after our almost partnership, he remained a valued connection, occasionally consulting on Rossi's expansion strategies. "Remarkable achievement, Marco," he said, shaking my hand warmly. 6 locations in 5 years, a product line in national distribution, and now this recognition. Horizon really missed out. "Everything in its right time," I replied, the phrase that had become something of a personal mantra. Our paths diverged, but both led to good places. My father, overhearing, nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that my independent journey had proven successful beyond what either of us had imagined possible. The validation was satisfying, but no longer necessary. I had long since stopped measuring my worth through his approval. Later that evening, as the celebration moved to the bar at our flagship location, I found myself in a quiet moment with Uncle Tony. Now semi-retired, he still consulted occasionally on specialized aspects of the business, his decades of experience an invaluable resource. "You remember what I told you that day at Millennium Park?" he asked, nursing a glass of Amaro Montenegro. "About some lessons having to be claimed rather than taught?" "I remember," I confirmed. The conversation had marked a turning point in my understanding of the family dynamics that had shaped our business. "Your father would never admit this," Tony continued, his voice lowered confidentially. "But you taking control the way you did, it was the first time he truly saw himself. In you." I raised an eyebrow. "His stubbornness? His temper?" Tony chuckled. "His determination, his refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. The very qualities that allowed him to expand from 1 location to 2 when everyone said it would fail." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "The difference is, you've learned to channel those qualities more productively than he ever did. You fight for your vision without creating unnecessary enemies." The observation resonated with my own reflections. I had indeed inherited my father's tenacity and conviction, but tempered them with emotional intelligence he had never mastered. The combination had proven powerful in ways neither of us could have predicted. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they'd just given you a real chance?" Tony asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "If they'd recognized your potential without forcing you to prove it so dramatically?" I considered the question carefully. I might have grown into leadership more gradually, with less conflict, less pain for everyone. I paused, watching the celebration unfold around us, my team enjoying well-deserved recognition, my family integrated into the moment in ways that felt authentic rather than obligatory. But I'm not sure I would have become the same leader, Some fires forge stronger. Steel. Tony nodded, understanding the metaphor. The Rossi way. Hard-headed, hard-working, with heart, I finished, adding the quality I had worked to emphasize in our family's legacy. As the night wound down, I found myself alone with my parents at a corner table, the three of us sharing a bottle of Special Reserve Barolo my father had been saving for a significant occasion. The wine, like our family, had matured into something complex and nuanced, bitter edges mellowed by time. "I have something to tell you both," I said, setting down my glass. "I've decided to create a formal succession plan for Rossi's." My father's eyebrows rose. "Seems premature. You're only 33. "It's not about retiring," I clarified. "It's about establishing clear processes for future transitions, documentation of ownership pathways, leadership development protocols, guidelines for integrating family members who might join the business." Understanding dawned in my mother's eyes. "So there's never another situation like what happened with us?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "I want any future generation of Rossi's to have transparent pathways to leadership based on merit and readiness, not ambiguity and assumptions." My father studied me for a long moment. "A formal system to replace family dynamics," he observed, not critically, but thoughtfully. "Turning values into policy." "Adding structure to values," I corrected gently. "Making sure that what we believe in, excellence, innovation, authentic hospitality, remains consistent even as leadership evolves." He nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing that this approach addressed precisely the shortcomings that had created our conflict. "Wise," he acknowledged finally, "and very unlike how I would have handled it." "That's rather the point," I said, a hint of humor softening the observation. My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've built something remarkable, Marco. Not just the restaurants, but a true legacy, one that can outlast any of us." Her words touched something deep within me. For years, I had focused on proving myself, on claiming what I believed was rightfully mine. The shift to thinking beyond my own tenure, to building systems that would nurture future generations, this represented the final step in my evolution from ambitious heir to steward of something larger than myself. As we finished our wine, my father proposed a toast. "To Marco," he said simply, "who taught an old restaurateur new tricks." "To family," my mother added, "in all its complicated glory." I raised my glass to meet theirs, completing the circle. "To Rossi's," I offered. "Past, present, and future." "Tebias." Crystal clinked, the sound ringing clear in the quiet restaurant. Outside, Chicago continued its endless rhythm, but in this moment, time seemed suspended. The painful past acknowledged but not defining us. The promising future beckoning but not rushing us. The present moment perfect in its hard-won harmony. I had bought a business out from under my parents to prove I wasn't too young to run it. In doing so, I had grown into a leader who understood that true success wasn't measured in ownership stakes or control, but in creating something durable enough to transcend any individual, even me. Especially me. The ultimate irony was that only by forcing my way into leadership had I learned the wisdom to hold it lightly, to see it as a responsibility rather than a prize. The very struggle that had once felt like the end of our family story had instead become its most important chapter, the one that ensured many more could follow. The morning after the award ceremony, I arrived early at the original Rossi's location. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting warm patterns across the dining room where 3 generations of my family had served our community. I ran my fingers along the bar where I'd first discovered my parents' betrayal. The polished wood, now a reminder of how far we'd all come. A knock at the door interrupted my reflection. My father stood outside, earlier than our scheduled meeting. I let him in, curious about his unexpected timing. "Couldn't sleep," he explained, settling onto a bar stool. Too many thoughts after last night. I prepared espresso for us both, the familiar ritual comfortable in its precision. I found something while going through old files, he said, sliding a yellowed envelope across the bar. Thought you should have it. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandfather to my father, dated shortly before his death. The faded Italian script spoke of legacy, of trust, of believing in the next generation even when their vision differed from your own. He wrote this when I wanted to open the second location, my father explained, voice gruff with emotion. He thought it was too risky, that we should perfect one restaurant before attempting another. We argued bitterly. I read the closing lines aloud. Remember, Roberto, the business bears our name but does not belong only to us. Each generation must make it their own, must build what they can see that we cannot. Your vision frightens me, but my fear should not limit your courage. Understanding washed over me. He gave you his blessing despite his reservations. And I failed to do the same for you, my father acknowledged, meeting my eyes directly. I convinced myself I was protecting our legacy, when really I was just afraid of becoming irrelevant. The admission, so long in coming, required no response. Some truths simply needed to be spoken aloud to complete their work. I'm developing a mentorship program, I told him instead, changing direction. For young culinary entrepreneurs from backgrounds underrepresented in restaurant ownership. Would you consider being an advisor? His surprise gave way to genuine interest. You think they'd want advice from an old-school operator like me? I think they'd benefit from someone who built something lasting from nothing, I replied. From someone who knows both success and failure, innovation and tradition. As we discussed possibilities, I realized we had finally found the right relationship. Not father and obedient son, not rivals for control, but two professionals with different strengths connected by blood and shared purpose. That evening, with all three Rossi's generations represented in old photographs watching over us, we hosted a special dinner celebrating our restaurant's history and future. My parents, my sister and her family, my team and their loved ones gathered around tables laden with dishes that told our story. My grandfather's original marinara, my father's award-winning osso buco, my mother's perfect tiramisu, and my own, modern interpretations that honored them all. What had begun with a devastating betrayal had transformed into something none of us could have imagined. A family business truly worthy of the name, where family and business had finally found their proper balance.